Right, okay. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah? Right, okay. Um, right, okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming today, and thank you for taking the time to watch our promotional video about STI Myanmar University, where you saw the type of courses that we offer in conjunction with the University of Bedfordshire in the UK and various other partner universities that we have. Okay, I was asked to just give a little follow-up talk on, in inverted commas, an academic subject. So what I'm going to do today, essentially, is I'm just going to give a little talk with tips for students, but there is other information in there that is hopefully useful to other people as well, because it's essentially about time management and study tips. Okay, so first of all, just let me introduce myself and say that my name is Aileen Prendergast, and I'm from Tunbridge Wells in the UK, and I've been here in Myanmar now for about 2.5 years. And I work in the Department of Education and Linguistics, and I'm responsible for teaching postgraduate students. I teach the MA in Applied Linguistics TEFL, and I also teach our diploma in TESOL, so teacher training. And then as far as undergraduates are concerned, I teach general English and I teach English for academic purposes. So the fact that I teach English for academic purposes and like study skills is basically what prompted me to make this little presentation that I'm going to do for you this afternoon. Okay, so my talk today is called The Pareto Principle, Making the 80-20 Rule Work for You. So are you familiar with the Pareto Principle? Familiar with the Pareto Principle? Right, okay. Well, I'm going to tell you what it's all about and how we can observe it in everyday life and how we can make it work for us when we've understood what it is. Okay, so what is the Pareto rule? And essentially, how can students use this principle to make better use of their time? How can we make less become more? Okay, so what is the Pareto principle? Let's focus first of all on this photo of this gentleman that we can see here, and his name is Vilfredo Pareto, and he is an Italian, and he was born in 1848 and he died in 1923. He was a man of many talents, but essentially he was an economist. And it was while he was doing economic studies and investigations at the end of the 19th century, he was looking into wealth distribution. And he noticed that in Italy, 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people. And then he went to look at wealth distribution worldwide, and he found at the time it was the same story. In every country worldwide, about 20% of the population owned 80% of the wealth. And he discovered that it was not just at that particular time, but if you went back about 400 years, you could see that it was the same case. And this economic finding of Pareto holds good for today, because today approximately 82% of the world's wealth is owned by only 20% of people. So what he discovered at the end of the 19th century still holds true today. Okay, so essentially that was a theory, or an observation rather, to do with wealth distribution. Okay, so he was looking at wealth distribution, and then he went on to investigate whether this uneven pattern of distribution existed in other domains. And he had a garden, and in his garden he grew peas, and he noticed that 80% of peas came from 20% of the pea plants growing in his garden, okay? So he then went on and he made other observations, and from his observations, people have worked on this since, and have come up with what we call the 80-20 rule, okay? So the 80-20 rule, which is based on Pareto's original theory, is that 20% of the input accounts for 80% of the output. So it's not a 50-50 thing. It's not 50% of effort will get you 50% of result, okay? It's 20% of effort contributes to 80% of result, and vice versa. So if we think about 20% of input, time, resources, and effort, this actually accounts for 80% of the output of results and rewards. So if we take this fairly straightforward example, we can see that, for example, in a company, in any company, it is 20% of employees who will be generating 80% of the results. And the remaining 80% of employees will generate the remaining 20% of results. So if you, the same would be true, for example, for sales. If you have a company and you're selling products, you will find that 20% of your products account for 80% of your sales, that 20% of your customers account for 80% of your sales. So we can look at it this way as well. We can say that it's the doctrine of the vital few versus the trivial many, okay? So if we look at the bottom part here, we can see that 20% of time focused on vital tasks will give 80% of results. And then 80% of time which is spent on trivial tasks will only yield 20% of results. Now, we'll go and take a look at, so we're looking at this idea of 80-20, yes? So that it's not an even distribution. So if we take a look at how we can observe the 80-20 rule in life, I've already given a couple of examples from business, but if we take a look at everyday life, here are some common examples of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule that we can observe in everyday life, okay? So when I say 80-20, 20-80, these are kind of like approximate, okay? It's just to show that the distribution is not even, okay? So if we take a look at the first one, we probably all know this, yes, that 20% of our clothes are worn 80% of the time. So the remaining 80% of clothes are languishing in the back of the wardrobe, taking up space, so we could perhaps remove them from there and pass them on and give them to people who might need them. 20% of the tools in a toolbox are used for 80% of tasks. So if you're investing in tools for DIY around the house, you don't need to invest in a fancy panoply of tools. You just need to focus on the 2 or 3 or 4 that are going to be used most of the time. We can see this principle also operating in sport. So, for example, 20% of the players in a team will be scoring 80% of the points. And 20% of professional athletes will scoop 80% of the medals and the prize. And if we think about staff employees and absenteeism from work, it's 20% of the staff who will account for 80% of absenteeism from work. So those are some like everyday examples. And then I've just got a couple of other ones that are also quite interesting. So let's just take a look at these. Okay, so 10% of Twitter users in the USA create 80% of tweets. Okay, so here we can see that it's 10 and 80. So it doesn't always have to add up to 100. Okay, 80-20 is just a handy way of expressing it. It doesn't have to add up to 100. That's just a coincidence. And it can be also more than 100. Okay. Now, in the UK, 80% of UK citizens live in 20% of the cities. Now, we all heard of Steve Jobs, yes, who was famous for relaunching Apple. So Steve Jobs saved Apple from bankruptcy in 1997 when he focused on 30% of the products that were generating cash, and he scrapped the 70% that were actually losing money. if we think about friendships, less than 20% of our friends probably contribute to the majority of our happiness and our well-being. And then the last one, when it comes to relationships, so in any personal relationship, you will probably only get 80% of what you want from your partner, because nobody's perfect, okay? So you will probably only get 80% of what you actually want in a life partner. So it's best to focus on that 80% rather than focus on the 20% which is lacking, okay? Right, so as my talk is essentially directed at students and studying, I now just want to say a few things about how we would apply the 80-20 rule to studies. Okay, so if we think about students today, learning and studying has to compete with a variety of other activities that young people today spend their time on. So we've had massive digitalization of communication, and this means that among the other things that young people do, like hanging out with friends and going to the gym and doing sport, there are two activities that dominate their lives today. And so these are social media and gaming, okay? Social media and gaming are the things that young people today spend quite a lot of their time on. So research in 2018 showed that worldwide, on average, people spend 2.22 hours a day on social media. And when they looked at the average amount of time that gamers spend on gaming, it turned out to be 6 hours a week. However, this is only average, okay? This is not the mean, this is the average. So recently I did a little informal survey among my students at STI, and I asked them how long they spent on social media, and many of them said 4, 5, and 6 hours a day, checking their Facebook account, checking their Twitter feed, checking their messages. And as for gaming, I had one young man who told me that he spent 24 hours a week on gaming, and another one who told me that he was doing esports or some kind of e-activity from 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. And this is while he is like supposed to be being a student at the same time. So I have to admit, I was frankly just a little surprised that this young man could spend his nights doing this and that he could study in the day. Now, the thing with these activities is they are of major interest, and they have changed all our lives, and mostly for the better. But when it comes to young people and studying, the problem with this is that they are also major distractions, because the people who design the programs for social media, the people who design the programs for gaming, they consciously build in techniques that addict you. I mean, I'm addicted to checking my Facebook, to checking my emails, to checking my messages, you know, and I'm well beyond my teenage years and early 20s, but it is an all-consuming sort of habit. But there was a very good program on the BBC when I was back in the UK, where the man who was responsible for virtual media, Jaron Lanier, the father of virtual media, he works in Silicon Valley, and he used to work on the inside, and now he's working on the outside, and he is trying to alert people to the fact that all of this is to get you to spend as much time on social media for data capture, which will then be used for artificial intelligence, which will then put us all out of a job. Okay, so if you want to find out more about that, you could look Jared Lanier up on the internet. Right, so if you are one of today's students and you want to have a social life and a life outside of study, you have to look at how to balance things. So the aim should be to have enough time for these activities, because this is what people like to do, and to be able to study as well. Because if you are a student, that is what your aim in life is. That's what you're there for. You're there to study. So basically, it boils down to maximizing your efforts to get better results, focusing on the 20% that is going to give you the 80% of results. So spending less time on achieving more. So let's take a look at this fact here. Approximately 75% of learning takes place in class, okay? So I don't really think that a lot of students are totally aware of this figure. 75% of learning takes place in class. The remaining 25% will be accounted for by reading and independent study and homework, etc. Okay? So if you're in class, you're a student, and class time accounts for 75% of your learning, then you obviously need to know how to maximize the time that you spend in class so that you're going to get better results. So the first one I put down here was attend, and I've put an exclamation mark, okay? Because sometimes students seem to think that they can learn without actually attending lectures or actually attending lessons. The second thing is to prepare. Turn up to lessons prepared. Read anything that you need to read before you come to class. Come with a notebook. Come with a pen. When you're there, engage in the process. And most importantly of all, why I've written this in red, is that you should take notes. And I kind of find today that most students don't seem to know what taking notes means, okay? Or they don't really understand the value of taking notes. Now, the value of taking notes is that information that is written down is stored in a different part of the brain to information that is seen and heard, okay? So this means then that when it comes to recall, if we've seen something, if we'd heard it, and if we've also written it down, we have two places in the brain which will help us to recall the information. So when it comes to studying for exams, for example, if we have written this information down and we need to remember it for exams, we've got twice the possibility, double the possibility of remembering that information. So how should you, especially like at university, I'm thinking, because I teach at STI, I'm thinking now about lectures, turning up to lectures and getting the most out of lecture time at university. But obviously similar would hold true for secondary schools. So in order to be a better note taker, you need to be an active listener, okay? You need to be listening actively in order to be a better note taker. You need to think about what's being said, how the different points connect to one another, and build on the knowledge that is already required. You need to be able to distinguish between the main themes and the supporting points, because not everything that all the information that you are receiving in a lecture is of equal importance. So it's working out what are the key points, what are the supporting points. When you write notes, you only need to write what's needed. So use headings and subheadings as necessary. Use common abbreviations and symbols. So for example, at STI, we teach architecture, but we never write the word architecture. We always write archi, okay? Archi, A-R-C-H-I. We never write that word in full because it's very long. So with any particular field, there will be particular abbreviations that are used. And then, of course, you've got the mathematical ones and then the general ones that we use in language like e.g., i.e., etc. When you're making notes as well at lectures, you should use diagrams, flowcharts, and mind maps if you help. Now, the brain has two sides, a left side and a right side. And the left side of the brain is linear and analytical. And the right side of the brain is global and holistic. So if you are taking information down in a linear manner, you are using the left side of the brain. And if you are taking information down in charts and flow charts and diagrams and mind maps, you are utilizing the right side of the brain. So you're maximizing your brain power as you take down notes. And then the purpose of all of this is eventually you're going to take an exam. And so all this is, as I said before, aiding recall. Okay, and then finally, organize the notes after class, review within in 24 hours, and keep any handouts. Now, the reason for writing notes in a lecture is the PowerPoint is simply there to support what the lecturer is going to say. So a lot of other information is being given that needs to be written down. And handouts are also supposed to supplement the information that the teacher has given. But the number of times I've been into a classroom and I've seen these bits of paper lying around and the students haven't bothered to take them with them. So they have no possibility of reviewing them again once when it comes to revising. Right, okay, so we looked at this idea of 75% of learning takes place in class time. Now, let's look at another point that is not only of interest to students, but of interest to us all, okay? So there is something called Parkinson's Law. And Parkinson's Law states that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. So a job will expand to fill the time that you give to that job. So if you take a common and everyday example, if you say, well, this morning I'm going to clean my kitchen, it'll take you a morning to clean the kitchen. But if you say, I'm going to spend the next hour cleaning the kitchen, you will clean the kitchen. The same level of cleaning will take place in an hour. So when it comes to student assignments, if you say, oh, well, I've got a month to do this assignment, or oh, I've got 2 weeks to do this assignment, it will take 2 weeks. But if you say, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write up this assignment this weekend, you'll get it done in a weekend. So this idea that work expands to give to fill the time available to it means that we need to kind of chop down the amount of time that we spend doing things. So as well as spending time in class, students are also spending time doing independent study. So how can students maximize their independent study time? Well, we have a technique which is called the Pomodoro technique. So the Pomodoro technique means that when you decide that you're going to sit down and do some work and do some study, you should set a timer and you should work on the chosen task with full focus. Yes, full focus for 25 minutes. Then you take a short break and then you do another 25 minutes. And then when you've done 4 of these Pomodoros, 4 of these 25-minute slots, then you take a 20-minute break and then you begin again. So essentially what you need to do as well is you need to look at the major task and you need to break it down into small manageable steps. And then you need to work out, you need to prioritize the steps that you need to take. Now, the person who invented this was another Italian called Cirillo, and he called his technique the Pomodoro technique because when he was a student, he used Pomodoro is the Italian for tomato. And when he was a student, he used a kitchen timer that was shaped like a tomato to time his 25 minutes. Now, this was probably before the time of smartphones, okay? Mostly nowadays, people would use the smartphone for a timer. But the inventor of this technique would advise against using the smartphone because if the smartphone is there as your timer, it's within reach. And then you might think, oh, I just need to check my messages, or I just wonder how many people have liked that post that I put on Facebook, and immediately you're distracted. So his idea is that you learn better, and this is not just for this, but you learn better when all the senses are involved. So if you're mechanically setting the timer, if you're writing down the list, if you're ticking the things off as you go along, this will lead to greater productivity. So we've looked at maximizing class time. We've looked at maximizing study time, sitting down to maybe write an assignment. But when we're at university, a lot of time is also spent reading. Okay, I think when students arrive at university, they're quite surprised at the amount of reading that they actually need to do. it's been proved that better readers make more successful students. So what is a better reader? A better reader is not someone who starts at the beginning and reads through to the end, okay? A better reader is someone who will have a strategy or a technique for reading. Now, a strategy or a technique for reading doesn't just mean reading more quickly, although obviously if you can read more quickly, this is beneficial because it will take you less time to read. But the point is, what are you doing with this reading? Now, generally speaking, when students are doing reading, it's part of research for writing assignments. So they have an assignment, they have reading and research that they need to do. And so they need to maximize the time spent reading so that they get the most out of this activity of reading. So I hope you can see what I have put here. So this is a mind map of a reading technique which is called SQ3R. Okay, so SQ3R is a reading technique. So let's start with the S. Okay, so if we just go up to the top, we can see S, so SQ3R. S stands for survey, okay? So when you take out your book or your journal article or whatever it is that you need to read, you first of all need to survey the text. So you need to look at the section headings, the title, the pictures, the graph, the style. What is the style of writing? Where has it come from? This is particularly important for internet sources. Where has it come from? Because not all sources are valid. Not all sources are reliable. So one of the important things to do when you're surveying some reading that you want to do is where has it actually come from? Okay, let's move on to Q. Q stands for question. Now, when we come to read anything in real life, like the newspaper, we don't just pick up the newspaper and start at the first word of the first article and read right through to the back. We generally have some questions in our mind when we open up the newspaper. So, for example, we know what has been going on in the world and we want to see what the latest developments are. So we have some questions in our mind, naturally, when we are reading in everyday life. So, when you are going to be reading for academic purposes, which is essentially what we're talking about here, reading for academic purposes, you have an assignment. What is it that you need to know for this assignment? Write down the questions. What is the information that you actually need? Because you need to find out pretty quickly whether that text is going to help you with those answer those questions or not. So you're going to ask questions about when and what and who and why, whatever it is that you're going to need to write that assignment. Okay, so we've looked at survey and we've looked at question. And then we have 3R. So we have read, recall, and review. So let's just take a look at these. So first of all, you will do so you've done the survey. And you will read, and we do skimming and scanning. Yes, everybody knows about skimming and scanning techniques for reading. So skim and scan to see if that text is going to answer your questions. Because if it isn't, put it away and find another one, okay, if it's not going to answer your questions. So skim, scan, read for gist, see if it gives you the answers to your questions. If you've decided that it has, then you read intensively. So you go through it with a pen, with a pencil, with a highlighter. You underline key points. You make margins in the notes. Once you've done that, you move on to recall. So you look at the answers to the questions, the important information, and the main points, okay? So you try and once you've looked at the text and underlined it and made notes, then you will take a pen and paper and then you will try and remember what those key points are that you've noted in the text. And so you will recall. So you can recall by reciting it out loud. You can recall by writing down the key points. And then you review. So you review your notes to see that you have all the necessary information that you need and that your notes are accurate. because normally students are reading in order to write an assignment, and you can't keep going back to all the different books that you read in order to find the information. Another very important point for students about writing from notes is plagiarism. Okay, so writing assignments is not simply cutting and pasting information from the internet. It's not copying things from the textbook, okay? Because if you do that and it is put into some checker to see whether you've copied other people's work, then your assignment will not be acceptable, okay? Your assignment will not pass. So it's very important when you're in class to take notes, okay? Because writing helps us recall things better. It's the same when you're doing reading. Making notes while you're reading will help you to recall the information better, but it will also give you something to work from that is between the textbook or the source material and yourself, so you are more likely to be writing in your own words than you are by simply copying the text. Right, okay, so I'm just now come to my last slide, which these two circles quite neatly summarize what I have just been speaking about, okay? So we started with this idea of Pareto's principle, which is that 20% of your work produces 80% of your results. So it's very important to make sure that that 20% of your efforts works for you. And then we looked at Parkinson's law, which said that a job will expand to fill the time allocated to it. So allocate the right amount of time. Don't just say, well, I'm going to do this now, and then not have a specific time that you're going to allocate. And then in the time that you have allocated to the task, if you focus on the main tasks, then you will get better results, okay? So this is, if you like, this is about time management and using techniques to maximize your time in order to maximize your study results. So as I'm a good academic, I'm just going to show you my sources where this information came. And then it just remains for me to say thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.